while various versions of the phonetic version of his name are known again as far back as hieroglyphic text and pyramid text, Seth is perhaps best recognized by the enigmatic animal typically associated with him. While several Egyptian gods are associated with animals, Horus with the falcon, with the jackal, Thoth with the ibis, or the bin chicken, apparently referred to in Australia, the identity of the specific animal typically associated with Seth remains enigmatic. About a dozen candidates have been put forward by Egyptologists, from wild hounds to aardvarks, pigs, and many other animals. There's simply no consensus among specialists about exactly what the Seth animal or the typhonic beast was. However, at a late period of the god's history, well after his demonization, a process I'll be talking about here in just a little bit, Seth and the Seth animal do principally become associated with the donkey. And along with Seth being a god of foreigners, the Israelite Yahweh, and even Jesus become associated by Egyptians in a quite late period with a donkey-headed deity. In fact, one of the earliest historical depictions of Jesus mockingly displays the crucified Jesus as a crucified man with a donkey head. Now, if you're curious about this whole Seth to donkey, Yahweh, Jesus pipeline, I've done a whole episode covering that whole process in detail in my episode on the foundations of the malevolent demiurge, typically associated with what we now call the Gnostics. But the identity of the Seth animal is probably not going to be forthcoming, and somehow that's fitting for a god whose very nature was to be unnatural, to transgress, and to sow confusion and disorder. So if the identity of the Seth animal causes confusion and disordered debate in the comments, then we'll just consider that all offering up to Seth. I'm sure he's more than pleased. But to get some general sense of how the Egyptians viewed Seth, it's perhaps worth mentioning the kinds of words that they use the Seth animal as a determinative for in their language. A determinative in Egyptian is just a silent hieroglyph that lets the reader know what the specific type or perhaps a semantic valence a thing had. If it were a divine thing, a person thing, a body thing, sometimes the papyrus roll is used to generate the idea of abstractness, 3 lines of plurality. The Seth animal is used as a determinative on a range of words, around 2 dozen or so, and they include things like illness, crisis, storms, disaster, verbs like to suffer, tumult, to scuttle a ship, to roar, to be violent, even a nightmare, to boast, or even snow, something I'm sure that was an oddity for the average Egyptian. Thus, Seth was linguistically associated with storms, violence, tumult, and disorder of the natural state of affairs. Now, of course, grammatical markers alone don't give us the whole story, and to better appreciate Seth, we have to turn to what is most important about him, his role in the Egyptian mythology, especially those myths where he appears prominently. As early as the pyramid text, Seth is associated with the murder of Osiris, one of the most important moments in Egyptian mythology, an act which basically inaugurates death into the world, but also provides for the possibility of human eternal life. And it's this dynamic that we'll see repeated in Seth's myth cycle, acts of often thoughtless, unnatural violence, which are shocking, but which work out for the best in the end, or in the case of Osiris, which were seemingly predestined. The exact means by which Seth murders his brother isn't clear in those earliest texts, and ranges from native Egyptian tellings to secondary tellings. The Greek sources are often much more detailed. The earliest texts often only vaguely hint at Osiris being struck down or trampled by Seth. Spell 477 of the pyramid text claim that Seth's attack was actually revenge for Seth kicking him. So that kind of got out of hand. In the later myths, his demise comes from being tricked into getting into a trunk and then cast into a watery grave. Death of unique horrors. Or in some cases, he's attacked by Seth in the form of a dangerous animal on the night of the great storm in some lowly or remote place, waylaid by Seth. Later tales have Osiris being infamously hacked to pieces only to be reconstituted by the magical powers of the Mythician cult. For their part, the Egyptians seemed like they were reluctant to discuss the horrible details of his primeval murder, perhaps out of respect to the great king of the dead. And the most detailed versions of the murder come from much later writers in the form of Greeks like Plutarch. Regardless of how the dreadful evil is done, Seth brings death into the world through the first murder. However, Osiris will not only last, but he'll last twice. He would become king of the underworld, but while dead, Osiris' sexual potency would be sustained after death, with his semen being used to impregnate his wife, Isis, who would give birth to Horus, the great contender with Seth. The mythological cycle in which Seth and Horus contend is one of the best preserved in the Egyptian records. In these myths, Seth and Horus, brother and son of Osiris, respectively, contend for the position of rulership of the world through physical, sexual, and physical combat. Again, the king of the world should have been evacuated with the murder of Osiris. During this trial by combat, Seth and Horus race boats, and fight in the form of other animals. They argue their case before the divine tribunal, with Thoth typically acting as moderator. This 80 years or so of violence, which goes on primarily so long because the lord of the council kind of is sympathetic to Seth, frankly. This even spills over into the divine court, with Isis attempting to harpoon Seth, accidentally striking her son Horus, who then in a rage decapitates his own mother. But not to worry, because Thoth is there to save the day. He gives her a cow head, so that fixes that. Thanks, Thoth. However, the story is also the most shocking element. Seth either seduces or just outright sexually assaults his nephew, again pointing to Seth's unnatural sexual desire and potency. A sexual potency which, unlike Osiris, by the way, isn't even fecund in life. But again, joke's on Seth. Horus is able to capture Seth's poisonous penis in his hand, which his mother then promptly cuts off and replaces. But then she causes Horus' semen to fall on Seth's lettuce garden. That very uniquely dressed salad causes Seth to become pregnant with a great golden disc, which he gives birth to and becomes either Thoth or is at least the golden disc worn by Thoth. So, semen combat aside, Horus does eventually triumph over Seth, but of course not without injury to both. Seth is either castrated or his semen is rendered infertile or somehow poisonous. Horus's eye or eyes are torn out and shattered, having to be reconstituted as his father was. The use of his eye, by the way, becomes the foundation for the fraction system. Mathematical here. However, the defeat of Seth does not constitute its destruction. In fact, it's more the case that the contending of Horus and Seth is about their reconciliation as metaphysical and perhaps even political principles. Metaphysically, Horus represents social and even meteorological order, with regularity, social stability, and a kind of legal calm. Seth, not that, is of course the unnatural power, the storm, the usurpation, the tumult. The world by necessity contains both those elements. In any metaphysical or cosmological or frankly mythological system about our world must admit of both. While we're going to ultimately share these reports before, in this way the forces of order and disorder are reconciled and brought into a unity that accurately describes and makes the most sense out of the world of the ancient Egyptians. Here, Horus is made lord of the land of the black soil, Kemet, while Seth is given rulership of the lands of the desert, red soil. Horus is the central god of the Egyptian core. Seth is the god of the frontier, the desert, foreign. Indeed, he's eventually associated with foreign storm gods like the Semitic Baal, the Lydian Ash, the Hittite Teshub, and eventually the Israelite Yahweh. And as I mentioned earlier, by extension, even the Christian Jesus at an early point. Remember the example of the Alexamenos of Jesus. And while Seth is never completely destroyed, he does face a kind of internal exile. He is to remain forever an alien, apart, unnatural God. and God at heart, as the prophet text often styles him. His marriage to his sister, Nephthys, can never produce children. She's known as an imitation woman with no vagina. Her child Anubis is of obscure parentage, perhaps through Osiris. Set is typically only thought to have parented, at least in one text, a kind of demonic crocodile named Naga. Some tales have him defeating primordial sea monsters like his Semitic counterparts Baal, Yahweh, and Marduk, again attesting to his great strength. And that strength allows him alone among the gods, to lift his massive scepter against the serpent chaos monster Apophis in protection of the sun god Ra on Sinai.
Bro, are you good? You stood there for like a minute and then your character just like flew around.
welcome to Das A. I was reading along, and though I had studied this topic before at length, something about it gave me the chills. Something about it creeped me out, frankly. Maybe it was the storm, or the cool autumn air finally breaking the summer heat, or just being alone in a big, dark, old house. But as I read along, I came to the line, and in another Baraisa it was taught that Abba Binyamin says, if the eye were given permission to see, no creature could withstand the abundance and the ubiquity of the shadim, of the demons, and continue to live unaffected by them. Similarly, Abaya said, they are more numerous than us. The demons are more numerous than us, and they stand over us like mounds of earth over a pit. And Rav Kunat said, each and every one of us has 1,000 demons to his left and 10,000 demons to his right. And though the text says that the divine does protect human beings from such creatures, there's no denying that the Talmud imagines our world to be a pandemonium, a literal pandemonium. This term was invented by John Milton in his Paradise Lost for the capital of hell itself. The word usually means something like chaos, but the Greek reveals that it actually means something like full of demons, replete, overflowing with demons. In the imagination of the rabbis, reality itself is infested in every nook and every cranny with shadim and ruchot and leilits, and demons. The idea, whether I believe it or not, doesn't matter, that just beyond the reach of that candle, as I was reading the text, that malevolent entities were lurking in untold thousands, was a truly uncanny notion to me. No text in the history of demonology has better attempted to catalog and describe, and perhaps most important, most infamously at all, to conjure and control that very pandemonium than the mysteriously named Le Megaton, or more commonly known, the Lesser Key of Solomon. In this episode, we're going to explore the early history of the role of Solomon in controlling demons, the history of the genealogy of demons and their various hierarchies, and the composition and construction of that most famous, infamous textbook of black magic, the Lesser Key of Solomon. And this episode is also really special because it's a collaboration with my colleague and dear friend, and of course fellow academic researcher of all things esoteric and occult, Dr. Angela Puka, over at her wonderful channel, Angela's Symposium. Now, Angela specializes in the academic study of magic and magic practicing religions and traditions, and comes from my shared background in philosophy, so you can expect that she's going to be just as sympathetic as I am, but also just as critical to the literature. She now focuses on contemporary esoteric and occult practices, which is great as a complement to esoterica, but mostly focus on past things. Now, Angela's going to pick up where I leave off and cover this incredibly important history of this text, and most importantly, its practices, into the occult canon of the late 19th and the 20th century, and all the way into contemporary practitioners of both Solomonic magic and a little bit into popular culture. In fact, she has 2 videos that you can check out on the topic. So again, make sure to check out Angela's Symposium for the continuation of this episode. And of course, make sure to subscribe to her channel and support her project, her symposium, if you're interested in this kind of material. And of course, if you're interested in magic or hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my content on esotericism topics as well, including curated playlists. And if you want to support work like this, long-form, accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism and the academic study of the occult, I hope you consider supporting my work either on Patreon. You can hook me up with a one-time donation if you like. You can use the Super Thanks option just below the video, or we have some pretty cool black metal style merch over on the channel. I'm kind of down with that aesthetic. But now, let's turn to the early history of Solomonic magic and to the Lesser Key of Solomon itself. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. So, first off, you should know that this video is actually a remake and an update, a significant update, of an earlier episode I did on the Lesser Key of Solomon a few years ago, really at the very early days of the channel. Now, I'll be both updating the information with new scholarship and also just improving the overall quality of the video. Now, if you've seen that older Lesser Key of Solomon video, I hope you'll stick around because there is a good bit more material in here. In fact, this video is about 10-20 minutes longer than the first video that I made because, well, I'm packing more material in. But it is perhaps unsurprising that Solomon, the famed Israelite monarch, would become the most celebrated magus of occult wisdom in the European theater, right there next to someone like Hermes Trismegistus. While Solomon is famous for being wiser than the man of the East and of Egypt, according to Israelite sources, not at all biased, he specifically is noted for his skill in botany and mentioning already the kind of like lurid wisdom, often associated with poison and magic, which really separate those things in the world. Further, he's credited with the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem for the Israelite God, and allegedly the gate complex, the gate complexes that survive in that area, which are part of the festival, and maybe are even testimony to a centralized, well-run kingdom, though again, depends on what kind of chronology you take. Despite this, the text also reveals a character which is also willing to seek out wisdom and pleasure well outside of orthodox bounds. The text chides his marriage to Naamah, the Ammonite, who becomes a demoness, by the way, in the Zohar. Naamah does. The importation of foreign worship, Avodah Zarah, and the mysterious mentions of his relationship with the Queen of Sheba, which has produced its own super fascinating lore, spectacularly epic cast. Here, though, Solomon is something of a transgressive character, a kind of Israelite Faust, whose pleasures and wisdom leave him dejected and reeling if you take Kohelet or Ecclesiastes to be in his voice. I love that book. Ecclesiastes Kohelet is just the best book in the world, in my opinion. The transgressive wisdom and liminal character of Solomon make him the best candidate for widely supernatural powers that stretch beyond common bounds of good and evil, are frankly even Israelite and non-Israelite, Jew and Gentile. As early as Aristobulus in the 2nd century BCE, Solomon is already being described as one of his predecessors. When Aristobulus is a kind of general philosophical wisdom, and by the turn of the Common Era, the apocryphal wisdom of Solomon describes the Israelite king as, quote, "For it is he who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists," like all of it, metaphysics, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements, the beginning and the end and the middle of things, the alternations of the solstices and the changes of the seasons, the cycle of the years and the constellation of the stars, the nature of animals and the tempers of wild beasts, the power of spirits, and the reasoning of men, the variety of plants, and the virtues of roots. I have learned both what is secret and what is manifest, what is esoteric and what is exoteric, for wisdom. The fashioner of all things taught me. Now, this is an incredibly important advertisement for the general wisdom of Solomon. Indeed, here we have the universal knowledge of Solomon enumerated beyond the mere botanical knowledge of the Book of Kings into a full panoply of cosmological, astrological, biological, even metaphysical, spiritual reality of all things seen and unseen. Here his wisdom is said to contain both exoteric and, as I mentioned, esoteric wisdom, properly befitting an Alexandrian philosopher of this period. I mean, these are the days of Zosimus of Panopolis. Now, as I've noted in another episode, many philosophers at this time, from Pythagoras to Democritus to Empedocles, and many others for that matter, were seen as not only possessing just worldly philosophical wisdom, but also esoteric secrets and magical powers. Even Plato is known to have had esoteric teachings. Indeed, there are spells in the Greek magical papyri attributed to these very philosophers. They're not just philosophers, they're also magi, they're mages. This ability to control demons, however, is not unique to the Alexandrian context. At Qumran in the Judean desert, we have a pretty fragmented psalm of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 11Q11, an exorcistic psalm, that's been recovered that also mentions the power of Solomon and his ability to control demonic forces. In fact, it's one of the earliest mentions we have of this power of Solomon. And in the first century of the Common Era, around the same time probably as the composition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jewish Roman historian Josephus, self-promoter Josephus, extended Solomon's power over demons in his writings in the Antiquities of the Jews, there in section 825. God also enabled him to that skill which expelled demons, which is a science useful in sanity restores their sanity. He composed such incantations also by which this temper were also alleviated, and he left behind the manner of using those exorcisms by which to drive away any demons so that they never returned. That's the thought he thought come back. And this method of cure is a great force unfound until this very day. Now, the manner of this cure was this. He put a ring on that had a foot of one of those sorts of demons mentioned by Solomon to the nostrils of the person possessed, the demoniac, after which he drew out the demon through the nostrils. And when the man fell down immediately, he abjured him not to return into that gentleman, making still mention of Solomon, using Solomon's name as a kind of apotropaic, and reciting the various incantations which he composed. In fact, the demon would fly out and split some water in a basin. Now, this whole episode, by the way, which was recorded of an exorcism performed by a certain Eliezer, before Josephus, but also in the presence of the Roman emperor of that time during the Jewish wars. Took a break from the war to watch an exorcism. But that was how renowned this magic was at that time. But here we have an early mention of a Solomonic ring with a power over demons, a feature that will reappear again and again and again, and will get its own episode, The Ring and Seal of Solomon. Of course, it's going to get its own episode soon. In the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, the trope of Solomonic control over demons, specifically in the service of the construction of the Jerusalem Temple, would appear in numerous texts, from the Gnostic library there found in Nag Hammadi to the Greek magical power found in also Egypt, although different places, to the Ginza scriptures, the right and left Ginza of the wonderful Mandaean people, may they be preserved, and maybe most importantly and most interestingly, in the Babylonian Talmud and the Testament of Solomon. These 2 texts provide 2 different stories about Solomon's demonic employ and the construction of the first temple. What they share in common is he used demons in both stories. In the Talmudic legend found at Tractate 1868a, Solomon is faced with a conundrum in Jewish law. The altar, and by extension the entire temple itself, must be constructed of unhewn stone. That is, stone that hasn't been shaped specifically with iron tools. Well, how is it possible then to construct a huge structure with unworked stone? Well, the answer, of course, is a magical worm. It's a magical worm known as the shamir, which is able to cut stone without the use of iron. Well, where do you get a shamir from exactly? Well, and again, this should all be obvious. You capture demons and you torture them until they confess that the only known demon that knows where the shamir is Asmodeus, the king of the demons, who's remarkably temperate. But, of course, what you do at that point is you get Asmodeus drunk, you fill what he normally drinks with water with wine, you get him drunk, you chain him up, and then you use a magical chain, and then you drag him back to Jerusalem. There you find out that while Asmodeus knows that the shamir, the magical worm, is on a distant mountain guarded by a sacred oath by a bird named the Dukifa, there's one in Aramaic here if you're interested, who then tricked into letting go of the magical worm, and subsequently kills itself for having broken its oath. It kills itself in shame, so the story got so dark there. At any rate, the shamir is eventually taken back to Jerusalem. Solomon and Asmodeus oversee the construction of the temple together somehow. Eventually, Solomon is tricked by Asmodeus into removing his magical change, and then he eats Solomon's ring and then actually knocks Solomon hundreds of miles into the air. And Asmodeus then takes over the throne of Israel, and Solomon retakes it after a few years, or maybe not. The story's kind of ambiguous. There's rabbinical disagreement about exactly who's ruling Jerusalem at this time, Asmodeus a demon or Solomon, so Rabbis disagree. Surprise, surprise. At any rate, this story just needs to Marvel movie. My mind, but you guys can call me Marvel movie people, and I will help you on the screenplay of this. It can be Solomon versus Asmodeus. You could put Magneto in there if you want to. I would like that if you could do that. Regardless, this is an amazing story. If you want to read it in the Talmud yourself, I put a link in the description, and you can go read the entire thing yourself. It's a hoot. But from a Jewish legend to a Christian one that is rated within the Testament of Solomon, typically thought to be composed in its current form, which is quite complicated, sometime in the early Middle Ages, but the text probably goes back to the first few centuries of the Common Era, and it will ultimately prove, I think, the really decisively important text, at least in the history of Western magic, because it's couched really in a Christian magical context. And this, again, rather complex text, a young man is being tortured by a demon. This demon's name is Ornias, and Solomon prays to the angel Michael to, well, fix this. Solomon is then gifted a magical ring from the angel, which binds both Ornias and the prince of the demons, Beelzebub. Solomon then uses the bound Beelzebub, not Asmodeus, in the construction of the temple here in the Christian story. Further, Solomon is then given the wisdom of all kinds of various demons, their astrological origins. That's going to prove very important for astrological necromancy in the Middle Ages, and the various powers which they said to have, which can now be brought under Solomon's control. Now, this includes a catalog of demons, and all of these kinds of catalogs with demons and their powers can be in some sense traced all the way back to the 3rd century BCE Book of Watchers, or the earlier sections of the Book of Enoch. That's Book of Enoch, chapter 8 or so, where we learn of the various corrupting roles of the various fallen angels in human affairs. By the way, that's a uniquely interesting theory of evil. In the Enochic theory of evil, the origin of evil, the angels come down to have sex with women, and they spread evil that way. This is a different and interesting rival to the earlier Christian theory of evil, where the angels, led by the devil, rebel against God, and it's in that rebellion they're cast out of heaven. These two stories are two different, interesting theories about where evil comes from in the world in Jewish apocalyptic theology, and that's an interesting distinction about how evil began in either the apocalyptic versions of Judaism or in the more specifically Christian versions. At any rate, two different theories of evil. The etiology of evil aside, Solomon is then allowed to interrogate these demonic planets. Again, this is probably maybe an echo of the old Gnostic worldview, where the planets are sort of demonic archons, and their various powers and their specific angelic adversaries. If you know their adversaries, you can kind of control them via angelic elbow grease. And a host of other demonic forces, including a Lilith-like demoness, also show up. Here she's known as Abizut. It's not clear exactly if she's Lilith. But you also have the various demons of the deacons of the Zodiac. Again, you can learn their powers, their astral locations, and how to bind them and use their astral powers to your bidding. And of course, Solomon binds many, if not all, of these demons. He forces them to work in the construction of the temple, even getting them to do menial tasks like carrying water around, which seems like a perfectly good waste of demonic power. However, the large cornerstone of the temple can't be managed by any of these demons because, well, there's a thwarting angel blocking them. And of course, that angel's Jesus. Yeah, it's Jesus. It's Angel Jesus. Though, eventually the wind demon, maybe this is Asmodeus, along with a demon living in the Red Sea, eventually do put the cornerstone in place. That's, again, the Jesus part is important because it's going to enter into Christian mythology. At any rate, the Testament ends with Solomon turning to foreign gods, because Solomon, and he, out of an intense love for, his mistress. But at any rate, he laments and tells the reader, don't make the mistakes I made. It's kind of like a after-school special, but not drugs, but demons. It'd be fun to make one of those like after-school 80s shows, but instead of drugs, it's necromancy. Like we could make it even medieval, but it's the Testament of Solomon that provides the who, what, when, where, about the nature, power, and binding of demonic powers in the cosmos. But, and this is pretty key, the Testament of Solomon is not yet a practical magical text. Now, it does contain much in the way of the how, and the C recension does begin to represent a formal reach, a real bridge in the direction of Solomonic magical practice. But we don't learn so much about how to perform the magic of Solomon, though at least one spell is attributed to him, the so-called Solomonic collapse. This is a spell that causes someone to go into something like an ecstatic trance, to be found in the Greek magical papyri in the 4th text, 850, 729. And Solomon's seal, by the way, is already mentioned there in PGM 4 as well, around 2007. It's part of an exorcism ritual of Solomon. The use of a magical text for binding magic is also to be found in the late classical Sefer HaRazim, or the Book of Secrets, and such an idea clearly also survives into the Islamic context as well. You can find in Ibn al-Nadim's monumental encyclopedia, the Fihrist, that Solomon is mentioned as having power over demons, and some of these demons, as enumerated by al-Nadim, this is also a trope that shows up in the Arabian Nights. So again, it's already being funneled into the Islamic context as well, and of course in the Byzantine context. So it's really spreading in all directions, and this remains a huge area of research, the exact way this all spread. But here we find what appears to be the first practically explicit text of demonic Solomonic magic, appearing by the late 15th century, somewhere in Greece, specifically in a Byzantine context, maybe in southern Italy actually. And that text is the Hygromancy, or the Talamonic treatise of Solomon to his son Rehoboam. And in that incredibly complex Greek text, Solomon describes the evocation of planetary spirits, angels and demons, the use of elective astrology, and the occult virtues of words, herbs, and stones. In addition, this text also accumulates a vast array of ritual and magical microforms, which kind of get stuck to this structural core and really form the basis of a lot of Western magic, from the knife of art, various forms of divination, the magical circle, and most famously, the powerful ring and seal of Solomon. In that text, the Hygromancy, that we get our first visual representation of the seal of Solomon. This treatise is, without any doubt, fundamental to the history of Western magnetism more deeply, and the Hygromancy is well worth digging into. It's that important. Western Latin context in the High Middle Ages, the Ars Notoria is also linked with Solomon through illicit use of demonic influence, and is meant to facilitate the rapid knowledge of the liberal arts, primarily by piety and concentrating on what are called magical noti. These are images that communicate this stuff. They're sigils. By the 12th century, William of Avignon and Albertus Magnus also mentioned at least 5 Solomonic books of necromancy floating around at that time, and would probably become part of the Solomonic corpus as we know it, and to the lesser degree to the lesser King Solomon. Over the next few centuries, mentions of other texts attributed to Solomon occur in lists of condemned books, and this is in transcriptions of interrogations by the Inquisition, so those are trustworthy. Indexes prohibitorum, these are lists of banned books, various condemnations like the one in Paris, and so on. Though it should be pointed out that while these books, and they bear similar titles to the ones that we see in the Lesser Key of Solomon, we can never be quite sure what those books were, because we have lots of books with similar titles that have lots under the hood that are different. These Sefer HaRazim, there are 2 versions of it, one Jewish and one Christian, and they are, while the title's the same, they're nothing alike underneath the hood. So again, just because we see lists of the books in these texts, additional records of books that they have here, those texts might not be anything alike under the hood or in the contents of those texts. However, one of those texts does remain remarkably complete, and that is a heptameron attributed to Peter Abano, that's probably provided, in the conjurations that would form the foundation for the later Goetia. Heptameron is basically where that invocation comes from. We also get demonic catalogs, which also proliferate in this time, such as the one found in CLM 849, Necromancer's Manual, but also, more importantly for the Goetia, in the French necromantic tradition, such as the Livre d'Esprit. That text would go on to form the later demonological core to be found in the Pseudomoniachia Daemonum of Johann Weier's De Praestigiis Daemonum. At some point, we should make these episodes in Latin, which, by the way, the De Praestigiis in turn would be translated into English from a manuscript for Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, which was pretty garbled by the time that Scott translated it, and that forms the hard core of the Goetia's demonology. Now, if all of this name-dropping and Latin titles and all of this seems difficult and, well, intimidating, it is. It's super complicated. But I've made in-depth episodes on virtually every single one of the texts I'm discussing in this episode. So if you want to dive into the history of Solomonic magic in a very deep way, a half-hour deep dives into just another great Praestigiis, check out my playlist on that subject. It is a deep dive on almost every single text mentioned in this episode. So if you really want to get a more robust idea of what's going into making the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Goetia, you're going to want to dive into that playlist, and especially make sure to watch to the end, because I have critical editions and expanded literature for virtually every single episode I make, and that's going to give you access to the best scholarly work on this material as far as we have it. So again, check out that playlist on the rise and the contents of Solomonic magic to get a sense of all the kinds of texts that go into making up the incredibly complicated Lesser Key of Solomon. But regardless, the Key of Solomon, the Clavicula Solomonis, in some form had become, for reasons that are still mysterious and require a lot further research, the book of necromantia, or black magic, in the European Middle Ages. And this status would persist all the way through the early modern period, into the rise of occult societies in the 19th and 20th centuries, and of course all the way into the contemporary period with modern Goetia magic. Indeed, the Solomonic magic tradition has reached popular culture in film, art, video games, and beyond. I mean, I've seen Goetia seals everywhere from anime to tattoos to random laptop stickers at hipster coffee shops with coffee way too expensive. But anyway, I still need to do an episode and circle back on the hugely complex literature of the Clavicula Solomonis text, but the scholarship is just in its infancy, and dozens, at least 150 manuscripts of this text are known to exist in various recensions, editions, and garbled states of transmission throughout the libraries of Europe and the Near East. Frankly, it's just a mess. And I think we are now just beginning to wade into what has remained some of the murkiest waters in the history of Western magic, from Persia and Iraq over to North Africa into Spain and Central Europe. We still don't have a good idea about what the landscape of even the manuscript tradition looks like for Solomonic magic in terms of a Clavicula Solomonis literature. I mean, there are Arabic and African manuscripts of these texts that they exist just in manuscript. There are 150 manuscripts of this text just in Europe in various libraries and various private collections. So getting into the Clavicula Solomonis literature is going to be a generation-long scholarly endeavor requiring half a dozen languages and scholars in numerous fields. So the Clavicula Solomonic literature, if you want to get into that as part of your big thing, get you some Latin, get you some Greek, get you some, I don't know, Arabic, and dive into it. You could change the field. Your research would change the field, and this is a place where if you're interested in history of ceremonial magic, the Key of Solomon literature is going to be one of the greatest scholarly endeavors of our generation to get a critical edition, to get modern studies, to get a handle at all on that literature. This episode, we're going to focus in on one tiny tributary of that literature, the Lesser Key of Solomon specifically. Nevertheless, that tributary has become decisively important in the history of contemporary Western esotericism, and the Lemegeton Clavicula Solomonis, or the Lemegeton Key of Solomon, often just called the Lesser Key of Solomon, is itself an English language anthological.
Hello, Elizabeth. We're going on an adventure.
нравятся мне пятые штуки. Я заниматься им не буду. Сотни девушек писали мне, давай займемся этим. Сори, я не практикую развлечения для бедных. Почитайте книги, развивайте свои интересы. Говорю, как будто стены умоляют на колени. Давай займемся этим, давай. Я слышу, это значит, мне пора съебать. И если тебе бы людей на это плевать, и если тишат, то блевотом на кровать. Мы с тобой все это видели. Это все ведет нас к гибели. За обиды вам не стыдно. Я ненавижу секс. 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 Я хожу в храм по четвергам. Батюшка сказал, что я молодец. Я всегда помогаю старикам. Мама меня хвалит, я хороший человек. Не интересуют плотские утехи. Думаю о чем угодно, только не об этом. Да я вхожу за километр. Всех людей, что помешаны на сексе. Все это игрушка дьявола. Грешная, одноголовая. Ходит эта суженый в поисках меня, для которого моя розочка цвела. Ничего нет отвратительней. Мы с тобой все это видели. Это все ведет нас к гибели. Садомиты, вам не стыдно. Я ненавижу секс. 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 Lay me down in a grave all alone with the things that I said and the bones that I broke. Lay low, I don't pick up my phone. I'm coming undone from the hurt I call home. Lay me down in the dark on my own, on a bed made of nails and a heart made of stone. I'll fade away if you let me. Please don't forget to forget me. I'm so tired, but I can't sleep. All these nightmares haunting me. Yeah, I'm so tired, but I can't sleep. All these nightmares haunting me. Lay me down in a grave all alone with the things that I said and the bones that I broke. Lay low, I don't pick up my phone. I'm coming undone from the hurt I call home. Lay me down in the dark on my own, on a bed made of nails and a heart made of stone. I'll fade away if you let me. Please don't forget to forget me. I'll fade away if you let me. Please don't forget to forget me. Семейка звучит уже по-другому. Скучать невозможно по родному дому. Хочется забыть, на былое все забить и плести перенестись куда-то дальше, но теперь уже без фальши. Место у параши раньше было важным, а теперь ты старше и стал слишком важным. Ебись конем, тупое поколение, как отчим с ножом перед растлением. Смотрю на свой дом и бьется быстрее, сердце немеет и хочется верить, но верить не выход, ужасный приход. Вирус на улице гуляет, пьяный сброд, но безнадега все равно съедает, как дешевый сырок. Бич объедает, преподай урок или помни, сынок, выживает в жизни только урод. Преподай урок или помни, сынок, выживает в жизни только урод. Семейка хорошо, семейка прекрасно, курорты, походы и бизнес-ланчи. Семейка хорошо, семейка прекрасно, курорты, походы. Идите-ка вы нахуй, как босиком бежать под дождем, как развести костер над отчим домом. Так и я проклинаю вас детдомом перед тем, как уйти на покой или попрощаться с собственной свободой, но без свободы. Птица в клетке, как брошенный ребенок в рыболовной сетке. Мы сходим с ума, каждый как умеет, но вы идете дальше, а это хоть важнее. Больше не будет потертых бенцев, больше не будет крутых ребестов. Пиво на крыльце стояли друг у друга, и теперь все это заменило нам супруга. На руке как жгут.
The Lesser Key of Solomon, specifically. Nevertheless, that tributary has become decisively important in the history of contemporary Western esotericism, and the Lemegeton Clavicula Solomonis, or the Lemegeton Key of Solomon, often just called the Lesser Key of Solomon, is itself an English language anthological book of ritual magic, anonymously composed sometime in the mid-17th century. I think the fact that it's in English has actually had a huge impact on its content. Even the name of the text is, frankly, complicated and mysterious. The Lesser Key of Solomon, as it is in many manuscripts, is actually the little key. And that means that it implies a bigger key, which is the greater key of Solomon text. No text calls itself that, really. And it's often attached with this phrase, Lemegeton, which looks like a Greek term, but it's not clear what that means. Now that word does occur in the Art of Victoria as a reference to another Solomonic text that we don't have, but the text there calls it a spiritual experimental text. It seems that the writer of the Lesser Key attached that name to this text, thus making a real text that either was lost to history or it never existed. Like people making Necronomicon. Needless to say, the term remains pretty mysterious. However, the Lesser Key of Solomon is an anthology of texts, meaning that the book is actually several texts under one title, which just isn't unusual for medieval and early modern books. Magical books will often come together despite their otherwise contents being pretty heterogeneous. It's pretty common to find manuscripts with several texts often bound together with some vaguely underlying theme like, it's magic, then bound together in one volume, even though the magical system described in the manuscripts don't really make sense. Solomon is, with the exception
no.
of Ars Notoria, concerned with the invocation and binding of both good and evil spirits. In this case, the Lesser Book of Solomon is in its maximum form composed of 5 texts, though often the fifth is missing for reasons we'll talk about. These include the Ars Goetia, the Ars Theurgia Goetia, the Ars Paulina, the Ars Almadel, and it's the Ars Notoria that appears in some manuscripts, though often missing the necessary notai. We'll come back to this in a minute. This composite text, as we have it, dates to the mid-17th century, as I mentioned, though it includes material going back centuries, back to the 13th century at least. For instance, the very medieval conjurations of the Heptameron is here being combined with demonological lists, often emerging from the French necromantic tradition, which forms a frankly ingenious hybrid magical practice. And that hybridization, by the way, would not end with the Lesser Key of Solomon by any means. Now, the most famous of these texts is the Ars Goetia, with its title deriving from the Greek goes, which means sorcerer, which almost always has a negative, malevolent mag.
No. What? Who the fuck is that? What are you doing? Are you gonna fight him? Hello?